What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, HPFP Reinstallation. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be installing a brand new high pressure fuel pump on this F30 328i behind us. This is going to be the same for any N20 or N26 powered car. You'll notice that there's two high pressure fuel pumps here on the workbench. That's not because the vehicle has two high pressure fuel pumps, but we did want to discuss real quick that there is a difference between earlier production N20 and N26 engines and later production N20 and N26 engines. And this pertains to the high pressure fuel pump itself with the electrical connector for the pressure regulating valve. Basically up to 3 of 2014, you would need to buy this version of the kit, which includes a new wiring lead, as well as this updated high pressure feed line to the fuel pump. If you have a later production vehicle, you already have this new pigtail on the engine harness, so you don't have to worry about it. You'd be looking at this kit right here. But since this is an earlier production vehicle, we are going to show you how to go about replacing and making this update to the car, which is going to be very important for those of you out here, because for those of you that do have an early production, you'd be really unpleasantly surprised to find that the connector doesn't just simply plug in. So with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this job, and we'll go ahead and get right into it. While it might seem like it's really complicated based on the amount of tools we have here, a lot of these tools are actually used for removing the windshield cowl. You're gonna have to remove the cross brace, so you're gonna need an E18 torque socket. But once you remove the entire cowl area, from that point forward, you're gonna need a T30 torque socket for removing the high pressure fuel pump. You'll need an E6, either ratcheting wrench or an E6 socket for removing the conduit support at the back of the valve cover. Torque wrench that can do inch-pound or low Newton meter specs, and another torque wrench that can do somewhere between 30 to 40 foot-pounds or 50-ish Newton meters. Because you're going to have to do a conversion, or we're doing a conversion on this particular car, a good wire stripper, good crimper, also a good pair of dikes for cutting the wires, really good butt connectors. You're also going to want good weatherproof heat shrink. I'm using some assembly lube for installation of the cam follower into the cylinder head. So now that we talked about the tools and other supplies you're gonna need to take on this job, let's go ahead and get right into it. There's actually just a lot of stuff in the way, including this cowl cover, but we're gonna start off with the engine cover first, which on the earlier N20s has a vacuum canister for your wastegate actuator. So we wanna make sure that we remove and disconnect our vacuum lines. Wanna try to avoid pulling as much as possible. There we go. Next up, we have our sound insulation for the engine, because these things sound pretty loud, a lot of ticking. All right, so next up, basically to gain access to the top of the engine, we need to remove the cowl cover. So we're gonna do that next. It's this piece right here. I'm gonna go ahead and start removing it. It's gonna be held in with a bunch of these style rivets like this. Some of these quarter turn fasteners up here, so just go about start removing those. But they should just be quarter turn. Once you turn it a quarter of the way, you should be able to just slowly start lifting it out of here. And then we also have these expanding rivets, and so these little pliers are really useful for getting these center sections out, like so. We also have this cross brace that I want to remove and get out of here. And then there's this cover underneath, which looks like it's held in by a bunch of 10 mils. So I have to remove some more stuff. You have these access plugs here on the windshield cowl. They gain access to the E-Torx bolts behind, and you'll be able to unbolt the cross brace and pull it out. The 4 bolts that hold the cross brace in are E18s. Next up, we want to remove this cover piece here. It's held in by several 10mm fasteners. Now we just go ahead and pull this right out, and that gives us full access to the top of our engine. So now I removed the engine cover and also the cowl cover, because we do have to replace the high pressure feed line as part of this update. Like I said earlier, this vehicle has an originally installed high pressure fuel pump, and vehicles built before 3 of 2014, you have to replace this wiring lead right here, because the connector for the fuel quantity control valve is different on the updated high pressure fuel pump. So this is a high pressure fuel system. So basically you have your low feed here, which is gonna just be in-tank fuel pump pressure, so less than 50 PSI. And then you have your high pressure feed line that goes to the fuel rail here. That's gonna be under the most amount of pressure, and my recommendation is you crack the flare nuts on that first. It's a good idea to disconnect the battery. If you decide to leave your battery connected, please note to not open the door. If you open up the door of the car, it will basically cause the in-tank fuel pump to prime, and fuel is going to spray everywhere. So whatever you do, don't open the door. Best case scenario, disconnect the negative terminal on the battery, and that's going to be your best option. So I'm going to start over here, take a rag. This is a 17 millimeter flare nut, and we're going to crack it. And we're going to slowly release the pressure from the high pressure feed line. And we'll also want to try to capture as much of this fuel as possible. Now we're going to go ahead and remove this flare. We're going to go ahead and break the seal at the pump. This should help release extra pressure. All right, all the pressure is gone, and we call it a good amount of fuel. Want to remove this line entirely, so because we do have to put an updated version in. So this is an E6 Torx screw here. We're just going to remove the screw to remove this bracket, or basically allow the bracket to move a little bit, so that now we can just go ahead and pull the line out. We're going to be updating this line to the newer style. That's part of the update you have to do for the new high pressure fuel pump. To be honest with you, the line is not that different. The only difference is it's going to have a rubber isolator on here. So basically along here, the hard line can't touch the other hard line. We have one more flare line or feed line that we need to remove. This is low pressure. Could be some volume that comes out of here, so we're going to be a little bit careful with this. Next up, we're going to remove our connector for the fuel quantity control valve. Here is the old style connector. Will not fit the new high pressure fuel pump. We'll show you that in a minute. And then from here, just two T30 screws that hold the high pressure fuel pump down to the cylinder head. So what I'm going to do is loosen these screws more or less a quarter turn at a time. What I don't want to have happen is I don't want this pump coming out sideways. Because there is some pressure from the cam follower pushing up on the plunger for the high pressure fuel pump. And I don't want this to come out all cattywampus and potentially cause some damage. So I'm going to be careful about this part. Yes, I know some of these are looking a little bit more than a quarter turn at a time, but I'm just trying to go evenly back and forth. And you can also see as I loosen the screws, the pump kind of goes back and forth. I'm basically just trying to walk it out. I'm going to go ahead and remove the mounting screws, and we're just going to pull our high pressure fuel pump out and away. There we go. The only thing that we need to carry over is this mounting bracket slash acoustic insulator. That's what they refer to this thing as. So the next thing I'm going to do with the high pressure fuel pump replacement, we're also going to replace the cam follower. But one thing I do want to show you is this cam follower is actually sitting down on the bore pretty good. What this cam follower does is it rides against the lobe on the exhaust cam. So you have a little roller bearing here. And then as the cam rotates, this comes up and down and it pushes the plunger on the high pressure fuel pump. You can see right there, the little witness mark from where the tappet on the high pressure fuel pump rides. Now this is really good shape. You don't really see too many wear problems with this. You know, you do see a little bit there and you do see a little bit here, but that's pretty normal. However, if you're installing a brand new high pressure fuel pump, it does make sense to go ahead and replace the follower at the same time. These are really cheap, it's easy insurance. Another thing that I want to consider in this as well is when you go to install the new high pressure fuel pump, you want that cam follower to be sitting low in the bore. Because like I said, this travels up and down along that cam lobe. If you saw that it was sitting somewhere up here, you would have to bar the engine over by hand to make it so that this cam follower is sitting low in the bore. You don't want to use the mounting screws for the high pressure fuel pump to basically force this back down. You risk damaging the high pressure fuel pump that way. So last but not least, we also need to replace our high pressure fuel pump mounting gasket right here. You should always install a new one just to be safe. All right, so here is our old high pressure fuel pump. Here's our new high pressure fuel pump. Everything looks the same with the exception of the quantity control valve. You can see that there's a major discrepancy in the connector, which is why for vehicles before 3 of 2014, you also have to buy this adapter lead. Now, on the vehicle harness, the wiring is red and white, not green with a white stripe, and also a white wire. So the question that we know you're gonna have is, how do I know which wire goes to which? Well, green and white is pin 1 and white is pin 2. And on the existing body harness for the original, basically before 3 of 2014, red is pin 1 and white is pin 2. So white is always gonna go to white, green and white on the adapter lead is gonna go to red. Also, if we're looking in BMW's wiring diagrams, they do show that the wire for pin number 1 is either red or white with a green stripe. And pin number 2, on the other hand, is always going to be white. And from this harness, we're gonna go ahead and give it the snip. I'm sure some of you watching are gonna be really tempted to solder this connection, but I recommend that you don't solder. Soldering is not used in automotive applications too commonly, primarily because of vibration. Vibrations can weaken soldering over time and cause it to fail. Almost every single electrical connection in a car is a crimped connection, because a crimped connection is not going to become loose due to vibration. So I recommend that you crimp these two harnesses together when you do the splice. Don't solder. And what I do after I crimp is just give it a tug, make sure that it's secured. So, like I said earlier, it's white with a green stripe to the red. So I'm gonna do that one first. And then by process of elimination, the white to the white is the last one that we need to do. And then our last one here is white to white. There we go, cool. So we double check our work real quick. We got white with green stripe to red and white to white. So we are good on that. All I need to do is basically just shrink our heat shrinking here, and that'll be a solid watertight connection. So I'm gonna use a heat gun to shrink the heat shrink. There's also like these little butane micro torches, but seeing as there's fuel, on the valve cover and fuel vapors from the open fuel system, don't think that's a good idea to use an open flame. So this is where the good old fashioned heat gun comes into play. Here's the new cam follower we're going to install. Only goes in one way. See this little notch here? That notch aligns with the notch in the cylinder head. To help prevent any kind of wear on startup, I'm just going to use a little bit of this Locomotive LM48 installation paste. It's basically a break-in lube. Could use oil for this too, but since we have the assembly lube here, I'm going to go ahead and use the assembly lube. So I'm going to put some here where the bucket for the tappet would ride, and I'm also going to put it on the side and the bearing. So when it starts up, even though there's some oil there, I just don't want this thing running dry. So here we go, just put a little bit of assembly lube here where this notch rides, also on the roller, and also where the tappet will sit in the bucket. So drop that in. It's a really good assembly lube. You can use it for a whole bunch of different stuff, bottom end builds, cylinder head builds. Next, we're gonna go ahead and install our new high pressure fuel pump gasket. Just sits here on the cylinder head, super simple. You'll notice that there's the little alignment tab here. That's gonna go over there. And we're just gonna go ahead and push it on this area here where it's facing up. That's the way it's supposed to be. If you look here on the mounting flange for the high pressure fuel pump, you'll see how it has these dimples right here. It only goes one way. That sits on top of the gasket, and that theoretically prevents oil from leaking up past the mounting bolts. However, there's an update on the mounting bolts. They have sealant on them to prevent oil coming up through the threads. So now we're gonna go ahead, installed our acoustic mounting plate, acoustic insulation, that's what they call it, back onto the high pressure fuel pump. And we're just gonna go ahead and drop it on into position. And to be honest with you, like I said, because that tappet is sitting very low in the bore there, the high pressure fuel pump just sits flush pretty much right off the rip. So that's a good thing. Next up, we're going to take our new mounting screws. These have thread sealant on them. You should always replace these and make sure that if you don't purchase the kit that we have on our site, make sure that you do order these screws with the thread sealant on them. And we're going to get the threads started by hand here. The other thing I'm going to do is our low pressure feed line. I'm just going to go ahead and get the flare nut started on that. Just thread it loosely in my hand for now. And now I'm just going to go ahead and slowly bring the high pressure fuel pump down onto the cylinder head so that it sits flush. Just a little bit at a time, back and forth, just trying to walk this thing down. We're going to install the new high pressure feed line. The only difference between the original one and the new one is this. It's this little rubber isolator. And it's gonna be right here. I imagine it's so that these lines here for the injectors and the ignition coils aren't frayed over a period of time by this feed line, because technically every single time the high pressure fuel pump pulses, there's a vibration in this line. So I can imagine over time that would probably wear through those wires, which is why they have this updated version. There we go. So actually you can see right here, this rubber isolator also isolates it from the low pressure feed line, and it also protects these wires that go to the ignition coils and the injectors. So highly recommended if you don't have an updated line to install it. If you purchase the high pressure fuel pump kit from us, it's going to have it by default. Go ahead and tighten our flare nuts here. Torque spec on these is 13 Newton meters plus or minus 3. You'd have to torque it with a crow's foot. I don't have a crow's foot, so I'm just kind of giving it a feel. Basically on these flare nut fittings, the only thing the nut is doing is it's making sure that the flared line is bottomed out against the flare or the female portion on the fitting. So it's the connection between the line and the base that makes the seal, not the threads. Common mistake is to over tighten these things, and that's where problems arise, because if you over tighten it, you risk damaging the flare line or the flare fitting, and you'll get a really bad leak. So don't need to go crazy on that. Just just use a little bit of common sense if you don't have a crow's foot to torque them. And the mounting bolts for the high pressure fuel pump, again, T30, we're going to torque to 12 Newton meters. And last but not least, just plug in our high pressure fuel pump quantity control valve connector. Just goes into place like so. And now we're on the home stretch. We just got to button everything back up. So after doing this job, before you put everything back together and you put the engine cover back on, go ahead and start the car. Check for leaks. Obviously at the fuel feed lines and at the fuel rail and at the high pressure fuel pump, you want to make sure that there's no leaks before you put it back together, and then find out later on. Also note that when you go to crank the car, it's not going to start right away. Obviously, because the fuel system has been open, it's going to take a little bit longer for the engine to start. Basically, the high pressure fuel pump being completely bone dry, it's going to have to push out all that air before it can start. So you're going to notice that it's going to take a little bit longer for it to start. That's totally normal. There's no special bleeding procedure for this. Just let the engine crank, it'll start. If it's taking too long, just hit the start button again to basically stop the cranking. Then hit the start button again, and it'll probably start right up. Like I said, there's no bleeding procedure on this. You just have to let the fuel system bleed itself out. So no big deal if you notice that crank's a little bit longer than normal. For this point, we just put everything back together. For starters, we're gonna go ahead and put this noise insulation back on top of the engine now. It's probably gonna be the easiest time to do it, because this thing kind of sucks to put on when you've put everything back together. It is your choice as to whether you want to leave this off or not. However, I do caution you that if you choose to leave off that noise insulator, you're going to hear a lot of injection noise inside the passenger cabin. So if that's not something that you're willing to live with, put that back on. Next up, we have a bunch of 10mm screws that secure this cover here in the rear. Next up, we're going to reinstall our cross brace. We're going to start all the bolts by hand. These are E18. We're going to torque these to spec. The reason for that is if you just run them down by hand, you do risk the chance of these loosening up over time, and you're going to hear a really terrible rattle. So I do recommend following the recommended torque spec for those bolts. Torque spec for these is 56 plus 90. Put our covers back on for the bolt access holes up here at the cowl cover, windshield cowl. Now I'm going to slide in these pieces here. Make sure the locks are basically twisted, so they shouldn't be like that. Otherwise, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to install this. And when you're turning them, you'll kind of feel the locking gauge is almost like a detent. If you don't feel anything, that means the cover is not lined up with the cowl cover there. And then we have this rubber gasket, which is kind of a pain to install, if I'm being honest. You have to make sure that this groove here lines up with that all the way around. So it's just kind of a matter of pushing it into place and working it. Now I'll go ahead and reinstall the strut covers there, and it kind of wraps around the seal here. So it should look like one cohesive piece when it's all back together. Got a self-expanding rivet that goes there. And now we got this cable that we need to put into this special channel that runs all the way across this gasket. Using a flathead screwdriver to pry that seal back also helps a little bit. And lastly, we're going to reinstall the engine cover because this is an external wastegate car. We do need to hook up these vacuum connections back to the wastegate actuator solenoid and the wastegate or the wastegate vacuum supply. This is our supply line back here. So that's how you go about replacing the high pressure fuel pump on your N20 or N26 powered BMW. A couple of things are going to vary based on the chassis that the engine is installed in. For example, you know, the cross brace, the windshield cowl, things like that. But the general process of removing the high pressure fuel pump, replacing the cam follower, updating the connector for those vehicles that are affected by the change before 3 of 2014 production date split, and things like that are all going to be the same no matter what platform the engine is in. As you can see, it's a very straightforward process. It's not that terribly difficult. You know, if you have fault codes for the fuel compensation control valve and all these other things going on in poor running conditions, you know, it's something that you can definitely take on yourself with basic hand tools. Although, you know, it might look pretty scary the first time you take everything off the engine, it's really not that bad once you get into it. So we hope you learned something in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. Also hit that like button, hit subscribe, we got plenty more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.